بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله الذي لا إله إلا هو على ما من به علينا من النعم الكثيرة الظاهرة والباطنة وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلوات الله وسلامه عليه أما بعد. By the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate, all praise belongs to Allah, the one that there's none that has the right to be worshipped except Him, who has bestowed upon His blessings that are numerous, those blessings that are outward and inward, and I bear witness that none has the right to be worshipped except Allah, who is alone without having any partners, and I bear witness that Muhammad ibn Abdullah, that he is His servant and His messenger. May the peace and salutations of Allah be upon him and his family and his companions and upon all those who follow, upon his guidance into the establishment of the last day. فنواصل معكم في الاستفادة مع فضيلة الإمام الشيخ أبي عبد الله محمد بن حزام البعداني حفظه الله وسلمه الله من كل سوء ومكروه. So we continue to learn with our beloved brothers and sisters, deriving benefit from the words of the noble, eminent Shaikh, the Imam Abu Abdullah Muhammad bin Hizaam al-Ba'dani, شرحا على بلوغ Maraam للحافظ بن حجر الأسقلاني رحمه الله تعالى, as he's explaining and commenting on the book that has been entitled Buluug Maraam, ماذا, by the great Imam al-Hafidh ibn Hajar, the memorizer Ibn Hajar, may Allah have mercy upon him. وهذا الدرس السابع, and this is class number 7. Class number 7.
غاز الأكسجين والماء لا يحتاج إلى تعريف.
He says, and water in reality doesn't need a definition. Water doesn't need a definition.
كما قال بعض العلماء بعض الأشياء تعريفها يزيدها جهالة.
He says, as some of the scholars, they mention, some definitions increase the person and not knowing the thing. Some definitions increase a person and not knowing the reality of that thing. He says, so therefore, water is known as water, and air is known to be air, and dust or dirt is known to be dust or dirt. So the definition is in need, or the definition is there and needed for it to be understood. He says, because, for example, some of you may never have heard the word hydrogen or the word oxygen. Perhaps you've never heard that word.
قال مسألة أقسام المياه. ذهب الجمهور إلى أن المياه ثلاثة أقسام.
He says the next chapter, the next issue is أقسام المياه, the categories of water, the various types and categories of water. He says, as for the first position, the Jumhur al-Ulama, most of the scholars of Islam, they divide water into 3 parts, into 3 categories.
الطهور وهو الطاهر في نفسه المطهر لغيره.
He says the first category that the majority of the scholars they give, as they mention, the categories of water are 3. The first category that is held by most of the scholars of Islam is at-tahur. That category of water that's called at-tahur. This at-tahur, it is the water that is pure in itself, and it can also purify something else. So the word tahur, this word tahur is used, it captures 2 qualities. It captures 2 descriptions, 2 qualities. And the first quality is that in itself it is pure, and it also can purify something else. As for the second category of water, it is tahir. The water that is tahir. This water that is tahir, also translated to be pure. Tahur can also be translated to be pure also. Translator's note. But the tahur, pure water, the meaning of tahur is the water that's pure in itself, and it can also purify. The second category, tahir, which is also pure water. But the meaning of tahir is water that in itself it is pure. In itself it is pure, but it does not purify something else.
وهذا القسم نعم انتقده بعض أهل العلم وقالوا إذا كان ماء طاهرا بنفسه فهو مطهر.
So some scholars, from the scholars of Islam, this second category, they criticize it. There are some scholars who say there's no type of water called tahir. But if the water itself is pure, if it's pure water in itself, then this water can purify.
النجس وهو الذي ليس بطاهر في نفسه أو النجس وهو الذي ليس بطاهر في نفسه ولا يطهر غيره.
And the third category is an-najas, the water that is impure. The water that is impure. This impure water, what is it? It's the water that itself, it is not pure in itself, nor can this impure water purify something else.
قال والتفريق بين الطاهر والطهور ليس بصحيح.
So our Shaikh, Muhammad ibn Hizaam, Hafidullah Ta'ala, may Allah preserve him, he says, this division, this separation between tahir and tahur, the correct opinion is that this is not correct. This is not correct.
فإن كل ماء طاهر يعتبر مطهرا.
He says, why is this? Because every water, every body of water that is tahir binafsihi, that is pure in itself, then this water that is pure in itself is considered to be water that can purify something else. Whereas some people, they say that there's water that is pure but it cannot purify. And they give an example, al-ma'u al-mustakhdam, or al-musta'mal, as the Shaikh says it. Water that was already previously used. He says, but this description is going to come, inshallah. We're going to comment on this when it comes. He says, some scholars, they say, this ma' al-musta'mal, this water that is used previously, like if someone makes wudu, and there's some remaining from that water, or he makes wudu from this water, or someone makes a ghusl from this water, and this is the remaining water. There are some scholars that say you can't make wudu from this water. He says, but we're going to explain when we get to that chapter that the correct position is the water, although it was previously used by someone else, as long as the water remains upon its natural disposition, its natural purification and purity, then the correct position is that this water can be used to purify. He says, so therefore, as long as the water is tahiran, is pure in itself, if it's pure water in itself, then the correct position is that this water can be used to purify something else. As long as this water you're referring to still has the name water, you still call it water. He says, in opposition of the water, that something falls in the water and it's no longer called water. You don't call it water. It loses its name. It loses its term water. Then this is different. He says, this water, something falls into it, it becomes juice. You no longer call this water water, you call it juice. So therefore, it loses its name. It loses its name. If water, something is added to the water, and this water, this thing that is added to it, are contents that turn the water into juice. So now the water is no longer water. He says, is this water pure? Something, the contents of what is used to make juice falls into this water. Is it still pure? He says, yes. However, it cannot be used to purify something else. He says, why is this? It's still pure, but why can't you use it to purify? He says, ذهب اسمه, because the name of water is gone. It loses its name of water. It's no longer called water. So now, the name of it, you no longer call it water, you call it juice. So this juice here is no longer water. But what we're talking about now is the water that is still called water. So therefore, the correct position, once again, regarding the categories of water, is that there are only two types of water, tahur and najis. The water tahur, translator's note once again, that is pure in itself and it can purify something else, and the water that is najis, impure. So he says once again, dividing and separating between the water that is called tahir and the water that is called tahur, in reality, the strongest opinion is that this is not correct. For verily, every body of water that is considered to be pure water in itself, then this water can purify something else. Based upon the generality of the proofs, translators note, from the Quran and Sunnah, from them the statement of Allah, translators note, that comes in Surah Al-Furqan, where Allah, He says, وَأَنزَلْنَا مِنَ السَّمَاءِ مَاءً طَهُورًا. When verily we, meaning Allah, we sent down pure water from the heavens, or we sent down from the heavens pure water. Surah Al-Furqan. So now the Shaykh, our Shaykh Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Hizaam, may Allah preserve him, he's asking a question to the group. He says, so who can answer? Who has the answer? What do we benefit when we say tahur? What do we benefit here? He says, you. What's the meaning of tahur? What do you learn here? So one of the students, he replies, he says, tahur, O Shaykh, is the water that's pure in itself and it can purify something else. So the Shaykh, he says, the word tahur is used when the water has two components. It's pure in itself and it can purify something else. This water is tahur. So it is pure water in itself and it can purify something else. So this is used when a person is making wudu, and this is used when the person is making the full body ghusl, the full body bath. Also when removing those impurities of the person.
قال كقوله تعالى وأنزلنا من السماء ماء طهورا وقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم الماء طهور لا ينجسه شيء.
Says based upon the statement of Allah where Allah says, and we, meaning Allah, sent down from the skies or the heavens pure water. And the statement of the Messenger alayhi salatu salama where he says al-ma'u tahurun la yunajjisuhu shay'un, where the Prophet says water is tahur. Water is pure in itself and it can purify something else, and there's nothing that can make it impure. So the majority of the scholars, they say the types of water are three. Because they say there is a water that it is not suitable to make purification from. And they use as an example water that has already been used previously. And we're going to explain when we get to that chapter that their breakdown here in reality is not correct. So there only remains two types of waters, and they are tahur, water that's pure in itself and can purify others, and water that's impure. So every water, or each type of water, or each body of water that is tahirun binafsihi, that is pure in itself, is suitable and correct for this water to purify something else. To purify something else. He says, and not dividing tahur and tahir, this was the position of Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah. As is mentioned in his book Al-Insaf, or in the book Al-Insaf. Also is mentioned in the summarization of the Islamic religious verdicts from Egypt. And is also the position, the strongest position, by the great Imam As-Sa'di rahimahullah ta'ala. As this is mentioned in his book Al-Ikhtiyaratu Al-Jaliyah, those tremendous notable positions. It is also the position of the great Imam Muhammad ibn Ibrahim rahimahullah ta'ala, as is mentioned in his collection of Islamic questions and answers. Also it's the position held by the late great Shaikh Ibn Baz, may Allah have mercy upon him, as is mentioned in the book Ghayatul Maraam by Shaikh Al-Ubaykan. Also is the position of the late great Muhammad ibn Salih Al-Uthaymin, as it comes in his explanation of Mumti'. So the next issue we're going to cover, he says, Hafidhahullah, may Allah preserve him, is the issue Al-Ma'u Al-Mudafu ila Tahir, is the water that is attributed to something pure. The water that is connected or attributed to something pure. So something is added to the water or attributed to the water, but this thing that's attributed to the water is pure. So it's going to come inshallah ta'ala. We're going to cover the different categories of this regard. So water has something or can have something attributed to it, and this can be in various situations. So the first of these situations is that thing that's attributed to the water and it's extracted from something pure.
ما ينزل من عروق الشجر إذا قطعت رطبة.
He says an example of this is ma'u al-wird, is, for example, rose water. Rose water. He says also water al-qurnafal, the water, the chlorophyll water. He says also the water that comes from the uruq al-shajara, it comes from the traces of a tree. He says if the purity of it is taken off, or the freshness of it is taken off.
المقصود اعتصر من الطهر أي استخرج منها بالعصر.
And then he mentions a sentence, I didn't get that.
ليس المراد أنه يضاف مع ماء. الأمور عروق الشجر إذا قطعت رطبة. المقصود اعتصر من الطهر أي استخرج منها بالعصر.
So he says, where he says u'tusira, he says here it's extracted from something pure. That thing itself is taken, extracted from something pure.
عصر. ليس المراد أنه يضاف مع ماء.
He says the intent here, the meaning is not that it falls into the water. No, it's extracted from something pure.
المراد ما اعتصر من الطاهرات أن يخرج من هذه الأمور. وليس المراد أنه خلط مع الماء.
So the intent here is not that this thing is mixed with the water. No, the intent here is it's extracted from something pure.
قال فهذا القسم الذي قال فيه ابن المنذر في الأوسط وقد أجمع كل من نحفظ عنه من أهل العلم على أن الوضوء غير جائز بماء الورد.
He says this category here has been mentioned by Ibn Mundhir, rahimahullah. Translators note, one of the greatest scholars of Islamic fiqh you're going to study, you're going to learn about. He has a book called Al-Awsat. Our Shaikh, Muhammad ibn Hizaam, he says, this Ibn Mundhir, he mentions in the book Al-Awsat that the consensus of everyone we have memorized from, Ibn Mundhir is narrating, he mentions the consensus. He said all of the scholars that we have taken knowledge from, we have memorized from them, from the people of knowledge, they all agree that purification is not allowed from or with rose water.
وماء الشجر وماء العصفر.
He says, nor is it allowed to make wudu from the water of a tree, the water that is derived from the tree. He says, or the water al-asfar.
العصفر نبات يصبغ به الثياب وغيرها وهو أصفر يميل إلى الحمراء.
He says, and this za'faran, this asfar, rather, this asfar, he says it is that plant that is used with regards to garments, to change the colors, like the dye, if you will, to change the colors of the garments or the likes. And it has a yellow tint, and it's more inclined towards a reddish color.
ولا يجوز الطهارة إلا بماء مطلق يقع عليه اسم الماء.
And then Ibn Mundhir continues. He says it is not allowed to purify oneself except with water that is absolute, unrestricted water. The water that carries the name of water upon it. It has the name of water.
ماء مطلق يعني ماء يقيد ماء ورد وماء كذا.
He says, our Shaikh, he says, the absolute water, what does this mean? This is the water that is not muqayyid. It is not restricted, like rose water or water of this or that. No, it's mutlaqan, it's absolute water, pure, absolute water.
لأن هذه لما قيدت دل على أنه ليس الماء الذي أمرنا بالطهارة به.
He says because if it's restricted, if you call it rose water or the likes, now this is not the water that we have been commanded to use.
ماء الورد ما استخرج من الورد.
The water that's ma'ul ward or wirt, the rose water is the water that's extracted from a rose. And ma'ul shajar, the water of a tree, is water that's been extracted from a tree.
فلو كان هناك عين تنبع من شجرة بسبب أن الشجرة بجوار نهر أو في أسفل جبل والعين تخرج من الشجرة فما حكم هذا الماء؟
Then he asks a question. He says,
بسبب أن الشجرة بجوار نهر ماء الورد ما استخرج من الورد ماء الشجر ما استخرج من الشجر. فلو كان هناك عين تنبع من شجرة بسبب أن الشجرة بجوار نهر.
He says, so what about if there was a spring, and the spring, the water comes forth to the tree, and then the water comes from the tree, but the tree was next to the spring. What's the ruling on that water?
أو في أسفل جبل والعين تخرج من الشجرة فما حكم هذا؟
He says, if there's a mountain, and then you have a tree near the mountain, and then the spring comes forth from the tree, and the water comes from the spring from this tree, what's the ruling of that water? He says, this water here that's coming from the spring, coming out through this tree, but from the spring, this water, one of the students says, this water will be pure in itself, and you can use it to purify something else. And the Shaikh says, yes, that's correct. So our speech, we're talking about water that comes from a tree. Water that is ustukhrija min ash-shajara. Water that is extracted from a tree. This water here cannot purify something else. He says, however, water that sprouts forth from a tree, then this is coming from a spring. This is different. So this water is pure in itself, and it can purify something else. So this water is absolute water. He says, however, in reality, there is an ikhtilaf in this regard. The scholars do differ in this regard. Translators note, he's mentioning this because he said earlier that Ibn Mundhir mentioned the consensus of all the scholars that he memorized from. So our Shaykh, Muhammad ibn Hizaam, he says, however, there are other scholars who take a different perception.
وقد أجاز الطهارة بذلك ابن أبي ليلى والأوزاعي واختاره شيخ الإسلام انظر الاختيارات الفقهية.
He says, and from those scholars who say that, or they differ here with the great Imam Ibn Mundhir mentioned, from them who says it is allowed to make wudu from the likes of those examples is the Imam Ibn Abi Layla. He took that position. Also Imam al-Awza'i took that position, and also Ibn Taymiyyah took that position, as is mentioned in his book Al-Ikhtiyarat al-Fiqhiyya, those decisions and positions of Islamic jurisprudence. And this is going to be explained in more detail when we get there by as Ibn Qudama conveys this.
إذا كان ماء الشجر بسبب وجوده بجوار نهر أو كذا فله نفس صفات الماء فنعم. أما إذا كان رائحته رائحة الشجر وكما يخرج من ماء النخيل وماء الأشجار الأخرى يكون على نفس رائحتها. كذلك جوز الهند أيضا يخرج منها ماء يكون رائحته رائحة الشجرة. فهذا كما قال ابن المنذر.
He says, so if there's a tree and the water sprouts from the tree because there's a spring, so it's coming from the tree but from the spring, then this is different. This water is pure. However, if the water is coming from the tree and it has the smell and the likes, he says, then this is what Ibn Mundhir, this is that example there.
وأما الشجر الذي يخرج منه الماء بسبب أنه مجاور للماء فهذا قد يغلب عليه صفات الماء فيكون طاهرا مطهرا. قال الثاني ما خالطه طاهر.
He says, and another description or another example is the water that something pure is mixed with it. You have pure water and something else that is pure is mixed with this water.
فغير اسمه.
So this changes the name of the water.
وغلب على أجزائه حتى صار صبغا أو حبرا أو خلا أو مرقا ونحو ذلك.
So this changes the name of the water and it overpowers the contents of the water, so it becomes like dye or ink or something that is khallan, he says, that is sour, or the likes of that. So he says this type of water, if you have a body of water and something pure falls in this water, is this, and it overpowers the water and it changes the contents of the water, can you purify from this water? Is this water still pure water or is it impure water? He says, he's asking the students, and someone says, that water is still pure water, O Shaykh. He says, yes, it is pure water, but you cannot purify yourself from it. He says, why not? He says, because this water is no longer called water. It's still pure. Yes, you have water that's pure. Something pure falls into the water and overpowers the water, changes the contents of the water. The water is still pure, but you cannot purify yourself from it. Why? Because it's no longer water. He says because it no longer carries the name water. He says now it becomes juice, or it becomes something that is sour or the likes, vinegar or the likes.
الثالث ما طبخ فيه طاهر فتغير به كماء الباقلة المغلي.
He says, and this last part is going to be kind of tight, we'll try our best. He says, the third example here is the water that has something cooked that is pure within it. And it changes it, so it becomes the water al-baqili al-maghli, the water that is like boiled, the water that it is boiled water, but it changes the contents of the water. And then he says this baqilla is full. So something is cooked, but this thing that is cooked is pure. And then when it becomes hot and boiled, water comes from it. So this is what we're talking about here.
قال ابن قدامة رحمه الله في المغني بعد أن ذكر هذه الثلاث الأنواع التي ذكرناها كلها قال فجميع هذه الأنواع لا يجوز الوضوء بها.
So Ibn Qudama, rahimahullah ta'ala, translators note, Ibn Qudama is another one of the greatest Islamic scholars of fiqh that you're going to study about. He has one of the greatest books written regarding the jurisprudence of Islam. And this book is called Al-Mughni. So Ibn Qudama and our Shaikh Muhammad bin Hizaam references him a lot. He mentions him often. He says, this Ibn Qudama, he says, these three types that we just mentioned, these three examples that we just mentioned, he says, all three of these types, it is not allowed to make wudu from this type of water. Nor is it allowed to take your full body bath with this water. And Ibn Qudama says, and as far as we don't know anyone who opposes this position. He says, except for what is mentioned from the Shaykh Ibn Abi Layla. He says, and the Asam. He says this Asam, he says, most of them who narrate from him, they are Asam, they are Mu'tazili in fiqh. They narrate from him in fiqh, but they have the Mu'tazili ideology. He says, so therefore, it is not correct to mention their opposition. He says, however, he's mentioning here to bring attention to it. He says, as they mentioned, Ibn Abi Layla and Asam, that water that is extracted from something pure, that this is tahur. This is their position. He says, they say that this can take someone out of the state of being impure, and you can also cleanse your garment from those things, and yourself and your area from those things that are impure with this type of water. He says, and some of the companions of Imam al-Shafi'i, they have a position regarding the water, that something was cooked in that water, something pure, and then water comes from that. They have a position regarding that. But the remaining of the scholars that have reached us, their position is that they differ with Ibn Abi Layla and Asam and those companions of Imam al-Shafi'i, that you cannot purify yourself from the types of from those types of water. Meaning that water that is no longer water. Something fell in the water. This thing is also pure, but this water, you don't call it water any longer. So therefore, it's not correct to make purification from that water. So there's a difference regarding that water, that something falls in it, and they differ over, is this water still water or not? Some say it's still water. Some say no, it's changed. It's no longer called water. He says, and the fourth component, and perhaps we'll stop here, is the water that something falls in the water and it is not possible that it is removed from it. He says, and he mentions a word that's new to me, like at-tuhlib. This word at-tuhlib is a new word, so we can't try to translate that word. He says, like at-tuhlib. He says, and that thing that falls on the water, from salt.
وما هو في قرار الماء كالكبريت والقار.
And he says, or that which falls upon the water like kibrit أو القار.
وغيرهما وكذا سائر ما ينبت في الماء وهذا النوع يجوز به الطهارة بالإجماع.
He says this category, all of the scholars are in agreement that you can purify yourself from the likes of this order.
قال النووي رحمه الله في شرح المهذب وهذا مجمع عليه.
Imam al-Nawawi mentions in his explanation of the book Al-Muhadhab, he says, and this is an agreement from all of the people of knowledge, that you are allowed to purify yourself from this type of water.
وقال ابن قدامة رحمه الله في المغني ولا نعلم في هذا خلاف.
And Ibn Qudama mentions in the book Al-Mughni, and we don't know anyone from the scholars to differ in this regard.
الخامس إذا أضيف إلى الماء ما يوافقه في صفتيه الطهارة والطهورية.
He says in the fifth point, or the fifth example, he says something is added to the water or attributed to the water, but it agrees with it regarding the two components, the two descriptions, meaning it is pure and it remains upon its purification.
كالتراب.
He says, like dirt.
إذا غير الماء فإنه لا يمنع الطهورية لأنه طاهر مطهر.
He says, for example, you have some soil, some dust, or some earth. It falls into the water. He says, and it changes the water. He says, then this does not change or does not prevent the purity of it, because it itself is pure and it itself is a purifier, just like water.
كالماء فإن ثخن.
He says, just like water.
بحيث لا يجري على الأعضاء لم تجز الطهارة به لأنه طين وليس بماء.
He says, however, if it's thakuna, that if it becomes heavy upon it, and whereas it can't, this dirt is put into the water, and then thakuna, it becomes solid, it becomes heavy and solid, clumped together, whereas it can't flow, it can't run over the body parts. The water, some dirt falls into the water, and then the water, thakuna, it becomes solid, it becomes muddy, and it becomes solid and heavy, meaning the water in this form can't flow over the body. If this is the case, then it is not correct to purify oneself from it, because now it becomes like clay, and it is no longer water.
قال ابن قدامة رحمه الله في المغني ولا نعلم في هذا خلاف.
And Ibn Qudama, as we mentioned, translates note, there are few scholars that are Shaikh references in abundance. So memorize these imams so you can go back and study their works. From them, Al-Mundhir, Ibn Mundhir. From them, Ibn Qudama. And from them, Shawkani. And from them, An-Nawawi. He mentions these four in abundance. Ibn Qudama, Ibn Mundhir, Shawkani, and An-Nawawi. So he says, Ibn Qudama mentions in the book Al-Mughni, we do not know anyone who opposes this position, that if the water, dirt or soil or dust falls into the water, but it's so much that it becomes thakhin, it becomes compacted and muddy and thick, whereas you pour the water, it doesn't flow no more. It becomes like mud and clay. If this is the example, it is not correct that you purify yourself from it, because it's no longer water, it is mud. It is clay and mud in this regard. طيب نكتفي بهذا واستعب دي يا إخوان. وسبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.